The wind cut through the streets of Chicago like a blade made of ice, and Marcus Thompson pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders, knowing it would do little to keep the cold from seeping into his bones. He sat on the frozen sidewalk outside a small toy store on Michigan Avenue, his back pressed against the brick wall that had become as familiar to him as his own skin, watching the endless stream of people rush past without so much as a glance in his direction. Marcus had become invisible somewhere along the way, reduced from a man with dreams and a family and a future to nothing more than another piece of urban debris that polite society had learned to step around. His cardboard sign, worn and faded from months of exposure to the elements, simply read the word hungry in letters that had long since lost their urgency, and the small coffee cup in front of him held exactly $5.37, the meager result of an entire day spent begging for compassion from strangers who had none to spare. There had been a time years ago when Marcus Thompson had been someone entirely different, a man who wore pressed suits and carried a briefcase and kissed his wife goodbye every morning before heading to his job at an accounting firm downtown. He had been the kind of father who never missed his daughter's soccer games, the kind of husband who brought flowers home on Fridays, the kind of man who believed that hard work and dedication were all you needed to build a life worth living. But then the recession hit with the force of a freight train, and the company downsized, and Marcus found himself standing in the unemployment line with 100 other men who all wore the same expression of shell-shocked disbelief. The savings evaporated first, then the house, then the marriage that couldn't survive the weight of so much loss, and finally his daughter, who went to live with her mother in a different state, leaving Marcus alone with nothing but his pride, and even that eventually crumbled under the relentless pressure of survival on the streets. Now as the December wind howled between the buildings and the holiday shoppers hurried past with their bags full of gifts and their minds full of plans, Marcus counted the coins in his cup and did the grim mathematics of poverty. $5.37 meant he could buy a sandwich from the corner deli, or he could save it and try to stretch it into 2 meals tomorrow, or he could find a spot in the shelter if they had any beds left, though they usually didn't this time of year. The choice was always the same impossible equation: eat now and suffer later, or suffer now in the hope that tomorrow might be marginally less terrible. He was still calculating when he heard the sound that would change everything, a small choked sob that cut through the noise of traffic and conversation and pulled his attention to the storefront window beside him. A boy stood pressed against the glass, no more than 7 or 8 years old, with tears streaming down his round cheeks as he stared at something inside the store with the kind of desperate longing that only children can truly feel. His small hands were pressed flat against the window, and his breath fogged the glass in rapid bursts that spoke of heartbreak and disappointment. Beside him stood a man in his late 30s, dressed in an expensive coat that Marcus recognized as the kind he himself used to wear, and the man's face was contorted with a pain that Marcus understood all too well, the agony of a parent who cannot give his child what he wants. The scene unfolded like a silent film, and Marcus watched as the father bent down to the boy's level, his mouth moving in explanations that clearly weren't providing any comfort, his hands gesturing in that universal language of apology and regret. The boy turned away from the window finally, his small shoulders shaking with the effort of holding back more tears, and Marcus could see what had captured the child's heart so completely. A red remote-controlled race car that sat on display like a small mechanical dream, gleaming under the store lights with all the promise of joy that $5 could never buy. Something shifted inside Marcus in that moment, something he thought had died years ago when he lost everything that mattered, and before he could talk himself out of it or remind himself of his own desperate circumstances, he was standing up and walking toward the boy and his father. His legs were stiff from hours of sitting in the cold, and his knees protested with every step. But Marcus moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in so long that it almost hurt. He reached into his cup, pulled out the 5 crumpled dollar bills that represented his survival for the next 48 hours, and without a word, without hesitation, without allowing himself to think about the hunger that would come or the regret that might follow, Marcus pressed those bills into the small hand of the crying boy and told him that every child deserved to have something that made them smile, especially during the holidays when magic was supposed to be real. The father looked up at Marcus with an expression that moved through several stages of emotion in the span of a single heartbeat, from surprise to confusion to something that might have been shame. And Marcus understood that look because he had worn it himself countless times in the past 3 years. The man started to protest, his mouth opening to form words of refusal or perhaps gratitude. But Marcus simply shook his head and stepped back before any conversation could begin, before the father could press the money back into his weathered hands, before the moment could become complicated by pride or pity, or any of the other emotions that make simple kindness so difficult between strangers. The boy stared down at the bills in his small palm as if they had materialized from thin air, as if Marcus were some kind of street magician who had just performed an impossible trick. And then his face broke into a smile so pure and genuine that Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, something he had kept locked away for so long he had forgotten it was there. Marcus turned and walked back to his spot against the wall, settling himself onto the cold concrete with movements that had become routine through endless repetition, and he watched as the father and son disappeared into the toy store together. His coffee cup sat empty now except for the 37 cents in change, not even enough for a cup of hot coffee to warm his frozen hands, and the reality of what he had just done began to settle over him like the falling snow that had started to drift down from the grey Chicago sky. He would go hungry tonight, and probably tomorrow too, and the shelter would almost certainly be full by the time he made his way there, which meant another night huddled in the doorway of the abandoned building 3 blocks south, where the wind didn't cut quite so deep. The rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to think only of survival and nothing else, whispered that he had been a fool, that he had just sacrificed his own well-being for a child he didn't know, for a family that would forget about him the moment they turned the corner. But as Marcus sat there in the growing darkness, watching his breath form clouds in the freezing air, he found that he didn't regret it. For the first time in 3 years, he had felt like a human being instead of a ghost, like someone capable of affecting the world around him instead of just enduring it. He had forgotten what it felt like to give instead of only taking, to offer something instead of constantly asking, to be the solution to someone's problem instead of the problem that everyone tried to ignore. The $5 had been everything he had, but in giving them away, Marcus had received something far more valuable in return, a reminder that he was still capable of kindness, that somewhere beneath the layers of dirt and desperation and defeat, there was still a man who cared about something other than his own survival. The toy store door opened, and the boy emerged clutching a bag with both hands, his face radiant with happiness, and as he passed Marcus on the sidewalk, he stopped and looked directly at the homeless man with eyes that held no judgment, only gratitude. The father placed his hand on his son's shoulder and guided him forward, but he too paused to look back at Marcus, and in that glance there passed an understanding between 2 men who lived in completely different worlds, but who, for just a moment, had connected across that vast divide. Then they were gone, swallowed by the evening crowd, and Marcus was alone again with his empty cup and his empty stomach and the snow that continued to fall, blanketing the city in white and covering the dirt and the grime and making everything look clean and new, at least for a little while. The night that followed was one of the longest Marcus could remember, and he had endured many long nights in his years on the street. He found his usual spot in the doorway of the abandoned warehouse, wrapped himself in the layers of cardboard and newspaper that served as his bedding, and tried to ignore the gnawing emptiness in his belly that grew more insistent with each passing hour. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the cold and the hunger and the sound of rats scurrying through the darkness, and Marcus lay there wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, if his moment of generosity would cost him more than he could afford to pay. But even in his lowest moments during that endless night, even when the cold seemed to seep into his very soul and the hunger made his hands shake, Marcus couldn't quite bring himself to regret what he had done, because somewhere in this frozen city, a boy was probably sleeping peacefully with his new toy nearby, and that thought provided a warmth that no blanket ever could. Morning came slowly to Chicago, the winter sun rising late and reluctant behind thick clouds that promised more snow before the day was through. Marcus woke to find frost coating his makeshift cardboard shelter, his joints stiff and aching from a night spent on frozen concrete, and his stomach twisted with a hunger so intense It made him nauseous. He pulled himself upright with effort, his body protesting every movement, and began the slow process of folding his cardboard bedding and tucking it behind a dumpster, where it wouldn't be thrown away by sanitation workers or stolen by other homeless people who needed it as desperately as he did. The routine was automatic by now, performed without thought, while his mind remained foggy with exhaustion and cold, and Marcus made his way back toward Michigan Avenue with the vague hope that maybe today would be better, that maybe someone would drop a few dollars in his cup, enough to buy something to ease the painful emptiness in his belly. The streets were quieter than usual for a weekday morning, the post-holiday lull settling over the city as people recovered from their celebrations and returned to the mundane rhythm of regular life. Marcus took his usual position outside the toy store, the irony of the location not lost on him as he thought about the $5 he had given away just yesterday, and he set down his coffee cup with its pathetic collection of 37 cents, knowing that he would need to earn at least enough for a single meal before the day was done. The cold seemed even more brutal this morning, or perhaps it was just that his body had less reserves to draw upon, less energy to generate the heat needed to keep functioning, and Marcus found himself shivering uncontrollably despite his layers of clothing and the weak sunlight that occasionally broke through the clouds overhead. Hours passed with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into an eternity as Marcus sat and watched the world go by, and the few people who did pass barely acknowledged his existence. A woman in a business suit dropped 2 quarters into his cup without breaking stride, her eyes never meeting his, and an older gentleman paused long enough to place a $1 bill among the coins before hurrying on his way as if proximity to poverty might be contagious. Marcus counted his earnings with hands that trembled from cold and hunger, tallying the meager sum that wouldn't be enough for even the cheapest meal at the corner deli. And he wondered how much longer he could sustain this existence, how many more days of cold and hunger his body could endure before it simply gave up and stopped functioning altogether. It was just after noon when Marcus heard the sound that seemed completely out of place on this ordinary street corner, the deep purr of an expensive engine that grew louder as it approached, the kind of sound that spoke of wealth and power and a world that existed far beyond the reach of people like him. Marcus looked up from his contemplation of the sidewalk and saw something that made him blink in confusion, wondering if perhaps the hunger and cold had finally caused him to hallucinate. A sleek black limousine was pulling up to the curb directly in front of where he sat, its polished surface reflecting the gray sky and the bare trees and the shabby storefronts of Michigan Avenue. And the vehicle came to a smooth stop mere feet from his cardboard sign and his empty coffee cup. The rear door of the limousine opened, and Marcus found himself staring at the same man from yesterday, the father who had stood beside his crying son outside the toy store window. But today the man's expression was different, no longer marked by the helpless pain of a parent unable to provide, and instead showing something that looked like determination, mixed with an emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. The boy emerged from the limousine next, clutching his red remote-controlled car against his chest like a precious treasure, and his face lit up with recognition when he saw Marcus sitting there against the wall. Behind them, a uniformed driver stepped out from behind the wheel, his posture professional and attentive, waiting for instructions from his employer, and Marcus realized with a confusion that bordered on panic that all of this, the limousine and the return of the father and son, somehow had something to do with him. The father stepped forward with purpose, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the concrete sidewalk, and Marcus instinctively drew back slightly, his years on the street having taught him to be wary of attention from people who belonged to the world he had lost. The man extended his hand toward Marcus, a gesture so formal and unexpected in this context that Marcus simply stared at it for a moment before his ingrained manners, the remnants of the person he used to be, compelled him to reach out and shake it. The man's grip was firm and warm, and he introduced himself as Robert Caldwell, speaking the name as if it should mean something, though Marcus had been disconnected from the world of business and news for so long that the name carried no significance to him whatsoever. Robert explained that he had spent the entire evening and morning searching for Marcus, that he had returned to this street corner at dawn and waited in his car down the block, hoping that the homeless man who had given his last $5 to a crying child would return to this spot. and Marcus felt a growing sense of unease at the idea that someone had been looking for him, that his simple act of kindness had somehow created ripples he couldn't understand. Robert's voice carried an intensity that made Marcus uncomfortable, a fervor that seemed disproportionate to what had happened, and he spoke about how his son Daniel had not stopped talking about the kind man who had given him money for his toy. How the boy had asked question after question about why someone who clearly had nothing would share what little he had with a stranger. The businessman explained that he himself had been so moved by the gesture that he had barely slept, that he had lain awake thinking about the contrast between Marcus's generosity and the selfishness he encountered daily in his world of corporate dealings and competitive business practices. Robert said something about how his own father had once told him that the true measure of a person's character was revealed not in moments of abundance, but in moments of scarcity, and that witnessing Marcus give away his last $5 had reminded him of a fundamental truth about humanity that he had somehow forgotten while climbing the ladder of success and accumulating wealth that no longer brought him any real satisfaction or joy. Marcus listened to all of this with growing bewilderment, his hunger-fogged mind struggling to process why this wealthy man and his son had returned, why they were standing here on the sidewalk talking to him as if he was someone important instead of just another piece of human wreckage that the city had produced and then discarded. He wanted to tell Robert that the gesture hadn't been as noble as it seemed, that it had been more impulse than virtue, that he had simply acted without thinking because seeing the boy's tears had triggered some deep memory of his own daughter and the father he used to be before everything fell apart. But the words wouldn't come, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't name, and so Marcus remained silent while Robert continued speaking, his voice growing more animated as he described how he had made a decision, how he had decided that he couldn't just walk away and forget about the man who had shown his son what real compassion looked like. Robert reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, thick and cream-colored and expensive-looking, and he held it out toward Marcus with both hands as if offering something sacred rather than just paper and ink. He explained that inside the envelope was a check, and before Marcus could protest or refuse, Robert quickly added that the amount was not charity, but rather an investment, a business proposition that he wanted Marcus to consider carefully. The businessman spoke rapidly now, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to explain, saying that he owned a chain of hotels throughout the Midwest and that he was always looking for people with integrity and character to join his organization. Robert said that he saw something in Marcus, something that years of living on the street hadn't managed to destroy, and that he wanted to offer him a chance to rebuild his life, starting with a position in the maintenance department of his flagship hotel downtown, a job that came with a modest salary, health benefits, and most importantly, an opportunity to prove that he was more than the circumstances that had brought him to this frozen sideway. Marcus took the envelope with hands that shook, not from cold this time, but from disbelief and something that felt dangerously like hope, an emotion he had trained himself not to feel, because hope on the streets was a luxury that could break you faster than hunger or cold ever could. He looked down at the envelope, then back at Robert and young Daniel, who stood watching him with matching expressions of anticipation, and Marcus felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him like something physical and overwhelming. This couldn't be real, his mind insisted. People didn't just drive up in limousines and offer jobs to homeless men. Fairy tales like this didn't happen in the real world, where every day was a struggle for survival, and kindness was usually met with suspicion rather than reward. But the envelope in his hands felt solid and real, and Robert's eyes held no trace of mockery or cruelty, only a sincerity that Marcus recognized because he had once possessed it himself, back when he believed that good things could happen to people who deserved them. Robert continued speaking, his voice steady and businesslike now, explaining the practical details of his offer with the same efficiency he probably used in boardroom negotiations. He told Marcus that the job would start immediately if he accepted, that there was a room waiting for him at one of the company's extended stay properties where employees in transition could live temporarily while they got back on their feet. The businessman outlined a plan that seemed almost too good to be real, describing how Marcus would receive his first paycheck within 2 weeks, how the company would provide uniforms and basic necessities, how there were programs in place to help employees work towards stability, and eventually their own apartments. Robert spoke about second chances and untapped potential, about how his company had built its reputation not just on luxury accommodations, but on investing in people that other businesses had written off as lost causes. And Marcus listened with a mixture of disbelief and desperate yearning, wanting to trust that this moment was genuine but terrified that it might somehow be a cruel joke or a misunderstanding that would collapse as quickly as it had appeared. The boy, Daniel, stepped forward then and reached out to touch Marcus's sleeve with small fingers that showed no hesitation or revulsion, no sign of the disgust that most people couldn't quite hide when they came too close to someone who lived on the streets. He looked up at Marcus with eyes that held an innocence and trust that seemed impossible in this harsh world, and he told Marcus in a voice that trembled with emotion that his father had explained how the $5 had been all the money Marcus had, that he had given up his own food to buy a toy for a stranger's child. The boy said that he wanted Marcus to know that the race car was the best present he had ever received, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant, because it had taught him something important about kindness and sacrifice that no amount of expensive gifts from his wealthy parents could ever demonstrate. Daniel added that he had told his father that they needed to find Marcus and help him, just like Marcus had helped him, and that his father had agreed, because that's what good people do when they see someone in need. Marcus felt something break inside him at those words, some dam that had been holding back 3 years of accumulated pain and loneliness and despair, and tears began streaming down his weathered face before he could stop them. He had spent so long being invisible, being nothing more than an obstacle that people stepped around or ignored completely, that having this child speak to him with such genuine warmth and recognition felt like being seen for the first time in years. The tears came harder now, and Marcus made no attempt to wipe them away or hide his emotion, because there was something liberating about finally allowing himself to feel after so long spent in the numb state of pure survival. He tried to speak, to express his gratitude or explain what this moment meant to him, but the words caught in his throat and all that emerged was a choked sound that might have been a laugh or a sob or some combination of both. Robert placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of human connection that Marcus hadn't experienced in so long that it almost hurt, and the businessman told him that there were no strings attached to this offer, no hidden conditions or expectations beyond honest work, and a willingness to rebuild. He explained that Marcus could take some time to think about it if he needed to, but that the offer would remain open regardless of how long it took him to make a decision. Robert added that he understood this must seem overwhelming, that accepting help could sometimes be harder than surviving alone, but that he hoped Marcus would trust him enough to take this chance because everyone deserved the opportunity to rise above their circumstances and reclaim the life they had lost. The businessman pulled a business card from his wallet and pressed it into Marcus's hand along with the envelope, telling him that the card had a direct phone number where he could be reached at any time, day or night, and that when Marcus was ready, he should call and they would arrange everything. Marcus looked down at the card and the envelope in his trembling hands, these small pieces of paper that represented a bridge between the world he had fallen out of and the possibility of returning to it, and he realized that he was standing at a crossroads that would determine the entire trajectory of his future. He could refuse this offer, could retreat back into the familiar misery of street life where expectations were low and disappointments were manageable because you never hoped for anything better in the first place. Or he could take the terrifying step of accepting help, of trusting that this stranger's generosity was genuine, of allowing himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his life wasn't over at 47 years old, that there might still be chapters left to write in a story he had assumed was finished. The choice seemed impossibly difficult and absurdly simple at the same time, and Marcus stood there on that cold sidewalk with the winter wind cutting through his threadbare coat, knowing that what he decided in this moment would echo through every day of whatever life he had remaining. Marcus found his voice finally, rough and cracked from disuse and emotion, and he told Robert that he would accept the offer, that he didn't need time to think about it because thinking had been his enemy for too long, leading him in circles of doubt and self-recrimination that had kept him trapped in a cycle of hopelessness. He said yes because some deep instinct told him that opportunities like this didn't come twice. that the universe or fate or whatever force governed the random chaos of existence had sent this limousine and this businessman and this kind-hearted child to his corner for a reason, and that refusing it would be a rejection not just of help but of life itself. Robert's face broke into a smile that transformed his features from serious businessman to genuinely joyful human being, and he immediately pulled out his phone and began making calls, coordinating with people whose names Marcus didn't recognize, arranging details about room assignments and work schedules and orientation sessions with an efficiency that suggested he was a man accustomed to making things happen through sheer force of will and reason. Houses. Within 30 minutes, Marcus found himself sitting in the back of the limousine, the leather seats so soft and warm that he felt almost guilty for touching them with his dirty clothes and unwashed body. Robert had insisted, overriding Marcus's protests about being too filthy for such a nice vehicle, saying that the car could be cleaned but this moment couldn't be recreated, and that he wanted Marcus to experience immediately what it felt like to be treated with dignity again. Daniel sat beside Marcus, chattering excitedly about his race car and his school and his plans for Christmas break, talking to Marcus as if they were old friends rather than a wealthy child and a homeless man who had met just yesterday. The driver navigated through Chicago traffic with practiced ease, and Marcus watched through the tinted windows as the familiar streets passed by from this completely unfamiliar perspective, seeing the city he had walked for 3 years suddenly transformed into something different when viewed from inside a limousine instead of from a cardboard shelter on the sidewalk. They arrived at a hotel that Marcus recognized from his previous life, one of the grand old buildings on the Magnificent Mile that he and his wife had once talked about staying at for their anniversary, back when such luxuries seemed attainable and the future stretched ahead full of possibilities rather than pitfalls. Robert led him through a side entrance reserved for staff, sparing Marcus the humiliation of walking through the elegant lobby in his current state, and they took a service elevator up to the 4th floor where the extended stay rooms were located. The businessman unlocked a door and ushered Marcus inside, and what Marcus saw made him stop in his tracks, overwhelmed by the simple normality of it all. The room was small but clean, with a real bed covered in crisp white linens, a private bathroom with a shower and toilet, a small kitchenette with a microwave and refrigerator, and a window that looked out over the city skyline. It was nothing fancy by the standards of people who had always had housing, but to Marcus it looked like a palace, like something from a dream he had stopped allowing himself to have. Robert explained that this room was his for as long as he needed it, that the refrigerator had been stocked with basic groceries, that there were toiletries in the bathroom, and clean clothes in the closet that should fit reasonably well until Marcus could purchase his own. The businessman handed Marcus a key card and told him that his work schedule would begin in 3 days, giving him time to rest and recover and adjust to being indoors again, and that someone from Human Resources would come by tomorrow to handle paperwork and explain the details of his employment. Robert emphasized again that this wasn't charity, but a genuine job opportunity, that Marcus would be expected to work hard and meet the same standards as every other employee, but that the company believed in giving people the tools and support they needed to succeed. He said that there would be challenges ahead, that rebuilding a life wasn't easy, and that Marcus would have difficult days when the temptation to give up would be strong, but that Robert had faith in him because anyone who would give their last $5 to a stranger's child clearly possessed the kind of character that was worth investing in. After Robert and Daniel left, promising to check in on him soon, Marcus stood alone in the center of the room and slowly turned in a circle, taking in every detail of this space that was now his. He walked to the bathroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror, really looked at himself for the first time in years, and barely recognized the gaunt, weathered face that stared back at him with hollow eyes and a tangled beard that had grown wild and unkempt. This was what he had become, what 3 years on the street had done to the man who once wore suits and went to business meetings and had a family and a future. But beneath the dirt and the damage, Marcus thought he could still see traces of who he used to be, and more importantly, glimpses of who he might become again if he could find the strength to take this second chance and transform it into something lasting. He turned on the shower, adjusting the temperature until steam filled the small bathroom, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus allowed himself to hope. The hot water cascading over Marcus's body felt like a kind of baptism, washing away not just the accumulated grime of 3 years on the streets, but also some of the shame and defeat that had clung to him even more stubbornly than the dirt. He stood under the spray for what might have been an hour, watching the water at his feet turn from dark brown to grey to finally clear, scrubbing his skin until it was raw and pink, shampooing his hair 3 times before it felt clean enough to be called human again. When he finally stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel that was soft and white and smelled of laundry detergent, instead of mildew and despair, Marcus caught sight of himself in the now foggy mirror and saw someone who looked slightly more like the man he remembered being. His face was still gaunt and weathered, his body still too thin from years of inadequate nutrition, but there was something different in his eyes now. A spark that hadn't been there that morning when he had woken up in a frozen doorway, wondering how much longer he could survive. He found the clothes that Robert had mentioned in the closet, simple items like jeans and t-shirts and sweatshirts, all in sizes that were close enough to fit his diminished frame, and Marcus dressed slowly, marveling at the feeling of clean fabric against clean skin. In the kitchenette, he opened the refrigerator and stared at its contents with something approaching disbelief. Bread and sandwich meat, milk and eggs, fresh fruit and vegetables, things that people with homes took for granted, but that had become impossible luxuries in his world of daily survival. His stomach cramped at the sight of so much food, and Marcus forced himself to eat slowly, preparing a simple sandwich and taking small bites because his body had grown unaccustomed to real meals, and he knew that eating too much too quickly would make him sick. Each bite tasted like a miracle, and he found himself crying again, tears dropping onto the plate as he ate, overwhelmed by the simple act of having enough food and a warm place to consume it. That night, Marcus lay in the bed with its clean sheets and soft pillows, and he couldn't sleep despite his exhaustion, because the mattress felt too comfortable, the room too quiet, the absence of cold and hunger and fear too unfamiliar. He had grown so accustomed to the constant vigilance required for street survival, the need to sleep with one eye open and one ear alert for danger, that complete safety felt almost threatening in its strangeness. He got up several times to check that the door was really locked, that this room was truly his and couldn't be taken away, that he hadn't somehow imagined the entire day and would wake up to find himself back in the cardboard shelter with an empty stomach and no prospects. But each time he checked, the room remained solid and real, and gradually Marcus began to accept that this transformation wasn't a dream or a hallucination, but an actual shift in his circumstances that he would need to learn how to navigate. The next 3 days passed in a blur of adjustment and cautious optimism as Marcus allowed himself to begin the slow process of recovery. He ate regular meals and felt his strength gradually returning, the constant exhaustion that had plagued him on the streets beginning to lift as his body received the nutrition and rest it desperately needed. He trimmed his beard and got a haircut at a barber shop in the hotel, and the man who looked back at him from the mirror afterward was someone he almost recognized, a ghost of his former self, starting to take on substance again. The human resources representative arrived as promised and walked him through paperwork that made him feel like a legitimate person again, forms that required his social security number and address and emergency contact information, bureaucratic evidence that he existed in the world's official records as something more than just a shadow on the sidewalk. On the morning of his first day of work, Marcus woke before his alarm, anxiety and anticipation combining to make further sleep impossible, and he dressed in the maintenance uniform that had been provided, looking at himself in the mirror and seeing not a homeless man but an employee, someone with a purpose and a place to be and responsibilities to fulfill. He made his way down to the maintenance office in the hotel's basement, where he was greeted by a supervisor named Frank, who showed no sign of judgment or curiosity about Marcus's background, simply explaining the job duties and expectations with the same matter-of-fact tone he probably used with every new hire. Marcus learned about cleaning schedules and repair protocols, about inventory systems and safety procedures, and he threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even himself, finding satisfaction in the simple act of being useful again, of contributing something positive to the world, instead of just taking up space in it and hoping for spare change from passers-by. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that Marcus had forgotten could exist, a structure of days marked by alarm clocks and work shifts and paychecks that arrived with reliable predictability instead of the chaotic uncertainty of street life, where each day brought only the question of survival. He discovered that his body remembered how to work, even after years of forced idleness, his hands recalling skills he thought he had lost as he fixed leaking faucets and replaced light fixtures and performed the 100 small tasks that kept a luxury hotel functioning smoothly. His co-workers accepted him without question, some of them sharing their own stories of hardship and second chances during lunch breaks, and Marcus realized that he had stumbled into a community of people who understood that life could knock anyone down, and that climbing back up required both courage and help from others willing to extend a hand. Frank, the supervisor, proved to be a patient teacher who corrected mistakes without criticism and praised good work without making Marcus feel patronized, and slowly the confidence that had been beaten out of him on the streets began to tentatively return. Robert Caldwell stopped by regularly, always finding some excuse to visit the hotel on business, but clearly checking on Marcus's progress, and these visits gradually evolved from awkward encounters filled with gratitude and obligation into something approaching genuine friendship. The businessman would sometimes bring Daniel along, and the boy would show Marcus new features he had discovered on his race car or tell him about school projects and soccer games, treating Marcus like a favorite uncle rather than a former homeless man his father had rescued. During one of these visits, Robert confided that helping Marcus had changed something fundamental in his own perspective, that witnessing such pure generosity from someone with nothing had made him re-examine his own priorities and values. He told Marcus that he had started a foundation to help other homeless individuals find employment and housing, using his business connections to create opportunities similar to the one he had given Marcus, and that in a strange way, those $5 had planted seeds that were now growing into something much larger than either of them could have anticipated. As winter gave way to spring, Marcus received his first real paycheck after the initial training period, and he stood in his small room staring at the direct deposit notification on his phone with hands that trembled slightly. The amount wasn't large by most standards, barely enough to cover basic expenses after taxes and the modest rent the hotel charged for the extended stay room. But to Marcus it represented something far more valuable than the dollar figure indicated. This was money he had earned through his own labor, not begged for or received as charity, and the distinction felt profound and transformative. He opened a bank account for the first time in 3 years, the simple act of signing paperwork and receiving a debit card making him feel like a legitimate member of society again, someone with a stake in the normal world of commerce and responsibility and future planning. Marcus began saving aggressively, setting aside every dollar he could spare with a discipline born from intimate knowledge of what it meant to have nothing. He ate simple meals, avoided unnecessary purchases, and watched his account balance grow with a satisfaction that went beyond mere financial security. His goal was to eventually move into his own apartment, to have a place that was truly his rather than a temporary room provided by his employer, and beyond that to perhaps reconnect with his daughter, who he hadn't spoken to since she moved away with her mother. The thought of reaching out to her terrified him because he didn't know if she would want to hear from the father, who had disappeared into homelessness and addiction to self-pity, but he also knew that rebuilding his life would remain incomplete as long as that relationship stayed broken and unaddressed. One afternoon in early April, Marcus was repairing a door in one of the executive suites when he encountered a guest who looked at him with an expression of shocked recognition. The man was someone Marcus had worked with at the accounting firm years ago, a colleague from his previous life who clearly remembered him and was struggling to reconcile the maintenance worker in a hotel uniform with the competent professional he had once known. Marcus watched the man's face cycle through emotions, saw the questions forming behind his eyes, and for a moment felt the old shame threatening to resurface. But then something shifted inside him, some newfound strength that came from having survived the worst and climbed back from the bottom, and Marcus simply nodded in acknowledgement and continued his work without explanation or apology. His past was his past, and while it had shaped him, it no longer defined him, and he owed no one an accounting of the journey that had brought him from that accounting firm to a cardboard box to this hotel room and the life he was now building one day at a time. 6 months after that frozen December day when a limousine had changed his life, Marcus stood in the lobby of his own modest apartment, a small one-bedroom unit in a quiet neighborhood far from the luxury of the magnificent Mile, but closer to something real and sustainable. The space was sparsely furnished with items he had purchased second-hand or received from co-workers who heard he was moving out of the hotel, but every piece represented a choice he had made, a step toward independence that he had earned through 6 months of reliable work and careful saving. He had passed the background checks and credit evaluations that landlords required, obstacles that had seemed insurmountable when he was homeless, but that his steady employment and Robert's willingness to serve as a reference had made possible. The apartment had his name on the lease, his furniture arranged according to his preferences, his food in the refrigerator and his clothes in the closet, and Marcus walked through the rooms, touching things with a sense of wonder that never quite faded, still amazed that this stability was real, and not some temporary situation that could be taken away at any moment. His relationship with his daughter Emily had been the hardest part of his reconstruction, requiring more courage than any other aspect of rebuilding his life because the stakes felt so much higher and the potential for rejection so much more painful. He had finally reached out to her through her mother, sending a letter that took him weeks to write, explaining where he had been and what had happened and how he was trying to piece his life back together. The response had been cautious at first, a brief email that was cordial but guarded, and Marcus had accepted that guardedness as his due, understanding that he had forfeited the right to easy forgiveness when he had allowed his pride and despair to sever their connection. But gradually, through persistent and honest communication, through video calls where Emily could see that he was sober and stable and genuinely changed, a fragile bridge began to form across the chasm that 3 years of silence had created. She agreed to visit him in Chicago during her summer break, and Marcus spent weeks preparing for that visit, cleaning his already clean apartment obsessively and planning activities they might enjoy together, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. The day Emily arrived, Marcus waited at the bus station with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and when he saw his daughter stepping off the bus, now 17 years old and nearly a woman rather than the 14-year-old girl he remembered, he felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. She was cautious in her approach, her hug brief and her smile uncertain, but she was there, and that fact alone was more than Marcus had allowed himself to hope for during his darkest days. They spent the week walking through the city, visiting museums and parks, eating meals in small restaurants where Marcus told her the story of the $5 and the limousine and the businessman who had seen something worth saving in a homeless man on a frozen sidewalk. Emily listened without judgment, asking questions that showed she was trying to understand rather than condemn, and gradually the stiffness between them began to thaw, revealing glimpses of the relationship they had once shared and might someday rebuild. On her last evening in Chicago, Emily told Marcus that she was proud of him, and those 4 words hit him with more force than any criticism or disappointment ever could have. She said that watching him fall apart had been the hardest thing she had ever experienced, but seeing him put himself back together was teaching her something important about resilience and second chances, and the fact that mistakes didn't have to be permanent conditions. She admitted that she had been angry at him for a long time, furious that he had chosen despair over fighting to stay in her life, but that anger had gradually transformed into something more complex as she grew older and began to understand that adults were just as capable of being broken and lost as anyone else. Emily said that she wanted to stay connected, that she couldn't promise their relationship would immediately return to what it had been before, but that she was willing to work toward rebuilding it if Marcus was willing to be patient and consistent and prove through his actions that this change was lasting rather than temporary. Marcus made that promise with every intention of keeping it, knowing that this second chance with his daughter was perhaps even more precious than the second chance Robert had given him, and that he would spend the rest of his life working to be worthy of both. After Emily returned home, Marcus threw himself even more deeply into his work and his gradual reconstruction, taking night classes to update his skills and pursuing a promotion within the hotel's management structure. Robert had mentioned that the company was always looking for people with both operational experience and the kind of character that couldn't be taught, and Marcus began to see a path forward that went beyond simple survival or even basic stability, a trajectory that might eventually lead him back to something resembling the professional life he had lost, though this time built on a foundation of humility and gratitude rather than the careless confidence that had made his first fall so devastating. 2 years after that December morning, when Marcus had given away his last $5, he found himself standing in Robert Caldwell's office on the top floor of the hotel, no longer wearing a maintenance uniform, but dressed in a simple suit that he had purchased with his own money from his new position as Assistant Operations Manager. The promotion had come after 18 months of exemplary work and completed coursework in hospitality management, and Marcus had accepted it with a mixture of pride and residual disbelief that his life had transformed so completely. Robert sat behind his desk with Daniel beside him, the boy now 10 years old and still carrying that same quality of kindness that had recognized something worth saving in a desperate stranger years before. They had asked Marcus to come to the office for what Robert described as an important conversation, and Marcus felt a flutter of the old anxiety in his chest, the fear that somehow this entire reconstruction might be revealed as temporary or conditional, though he knew rationally that his position was secure and his performance beyond reproach. Robert explained that the foundation he had started to help homeless individuals find employment and housing had grown beyond his initial expectations, now operating in 5 cities and helping hundreds of people transition off the streets and into stable lives. The businessman said that the foundation needed a director, someone who could oversee operations and expansions, someone who understood both the business side of running an organization and the human side of what it meant to have lost everything and fight to reclaim it. He said that he couldn't think of anyone more qualified than Marcus, whose own journey from that frozen sidewalk to this executive office represented exactly the kind of transformation the foundation existed to facilitate. Robert offered Marcus the position with a salary that was more than he had ever earned even in his previous life as an accountant, along with the opportunity to dedicate his work to ensuring that other people received the same second chance that had saved his life. Marcus accepted without hesitation, understanding that this role represented not just a career opportunity, but a chance to transform his own suffering into something meaningful and lasting. He thought about all the people he had known during his years on the streets, men and women who had been kind to him or cruel, who had shared their meager resources or hoarded them jealously, who had maintained their humanity or lost it to addiction and despair, and he knew that many of them possessed the same potential for redemption that Robert had seen in him. The foundation could be the bridge for some of them, the limousine that pulled up at exactly the right moment with an offer of dignity and work, and the chance to remember who they had been before the world had knocked them down. Marcus knew he couldn't save everyone, that some people were too far gone or too unwilling to accept help, but he could try, and in trying he could honor the gift that had been given to him by a businessman and his son who had understood that $5 represented more than its monetary value. In the months that followed, Marcus threw himself into his new role with a passion that surprised even Robert, traveling to different cities to oversee foundation operations, interviewing candidates for employment programs, speaking at fundraising events about his own experience, with a honesty that made donors reach for their checkbooks and corporate partners eager to participate. He became the public face of Second Chances, his story appearing in newspapers and on local television programs, and while the attention made him uncomfortable at first, Marcus learned to embrace it because he understood that his visibility gave hope to people who desperately needed to believe that climbing out of the pit was possible. He hired former homeless individuals for foundation positions whenever possible, surrounding himself with people who shared his understanding of what it meant to survive on society's margins and what it took to find your way back to its center. Emily visited more frequently now, spending holidays and school breaks with her father, and their relationship had evolved into something different from what it had been before, but perhaps deeper and more authentic, because it was built on honesty rather than the comfortable illusions that had characterized his earlier life. She told him once that having a father who had been homeless and rebuilt himself was actually cooler than having a father who had never failed, that his story had taught her more about courage and resilience than any amount of conventional success ever could have. Marcus treasured those words, keeping them close during moments when doubt crept in, or when the weight of his responsibilities felt overwhelming, reminding himself that his fall and recovery had value beyond his own life, that the suffering had been transformed into lessons, and the lessons into a legacy that might outlive him. On the third anniversary of the day he had given Daniel those $5, Marcus returned to the corner outside the toy store on Michigan Avenue, not as a homeless man seeking spare change, but as someone who wanted to remember and honor where his journey had begun. He stood on that sidewalk in his suit and overcoat, watching the crowds hurry past, just as they had when he was invisible to them, and he thought about the chain of events that a simple act of kindness had set in motion. Those $5 had bought more than a toy for a crying child. They had purchased Marcus's salvation, had revealed to Robert Caldwell that generosity still existed in unexpected places, had created a foundation that was now changing hundreds of lives, had rebuilt a relationship between father and daughter, and had proven that the darkest moments of a person's life didn't have to define their entire story. Marcus understood now that he hadn't been saved by Robert's wealth or connections, but by his own choice in that moment of scarcity to value a stranger's joy over his own survival, and that choice had revealed a truth that no amount of success or failure could change, that the measure of a human being was found not in what they possessed, but in what they were willing to give away, especially when giving meant sacrifice, and that sometimes this small, less gestures created the largest transformations, rippling outward in ways that could never be predicted or fully understood, but that nevertheless changed the world, one act of kindness at a time.